to go ahead and call this committee meeting of the whole of the Urbana City Council to order. And right now, I'd like to ask the clerk to call the roll.
Chair Barnes.
Here.
Mr. Bowersox.
Here.
Ms. Chenoweth.
Present.
Mr. Lewis.
Here.
Mr. Roberts.
Here.
Mr. Smythe. Ms. Stevenson.
Present.
Mayor Pressing.
Do we have any additions to the agenda tonight? Yes, Charlie?
I'd like to move items 9 and 10 up earlier in the agenda, following item number 6. I think we can get those done quickly.
Okay, so 9 and 10 after item 6.
Item 6, and that way any staff that are not needed for anything else can get out of here.
Okay. Is there a motion to amend the agenda as Charlie's described? Is there a second?
Second.
All those in favor indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Okay, so we've changed the agenda to move items 9 and 10 after item 6. All right. Do we have a staff report tonight? Anyone? Okay. If not, it's time for approval of the minutes of the previous meeting.
So moved.
All those in any, are there any changes? You guys are so fast. Okay, Brandon?
I had one question. I didn't know on the Royer motion if, Danielle, you wanted to particularly clarify. It said Ms. Chenoweth suggested adding something about arts to the motion, but other than that, it doesn't really capture. You I think, talked about connecting Royer, the Royer district to the broader Arts Commission and downtown entertainment sort of district phenomenon. Do you want to change any of that wording?
Yeah, I guess I'd make a motion to say that Ms. Chenoweth suggested adding, connecting the Royer district to the current arts program initiative to the motion.
I'd second that. Sure.
Okay, there's been an amendment to the minutes, so let's go ahead and vote on the minutes as amended. All those in favor indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Okay, those are passed. Let's go on with public input, and at this time, I just have one. If there are others, feel free to get those slips up to me. But our first guest is Carolyn Baxley. Would you please step on up and state your name and address for the record? And please limit your comments to just about 5 minutes. Thank you.
Carolyn Baxley, 510 West Main, Urbana, and I may not hold out for the entire meeting tonight. I've been a little under the weather, so I just wanted to speak initially and continue to applaud council for your interest in doing some historic preservation initiatives. I read the packet. I just got back into town. I read it kind of late. But it appears that you're considering some interesting incentives. I think staff had some very good comments to make about them, which, it's their job to think through all the ins and outs of various things that are proposed. One point that I wanted to make is in regard to demolition review or delay. If you're going to do that, which I think you really should look at demo permits that are granted, particularly in West Urbana, I think maybe a more practical approach, rather than have every single demo permit reviewed, would be to do some kind of thing like was done when we put the MOR ordinance into effect. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, that council at that time passed a moratorium that basically no permits were issued within that particular area that was being studied until the end of the study. So, rather than have an ongoing staff-intensive, labor-intensive review or delay of, permit or whatever, you might consider just a time-limited, this is how long it's going to take us to determine which properties within this area, need to be looked at more closely. The old PACA survey, everyone knows it's out of date. They acknowledge it's out of date. It wasn't done in any great depth, even at the time that it was done. So it's time for that to be renewed, and hopefully the city could make some headway on that and look at that area bounded by Florida, to Maine, race to Lincoln, and, perhaps consider just a time-limited, let's don't tear down anything else in here until we have a chance to see if these are contributing properties. So that's my suggestion on that point. But I think the incentives that you're looking at, any incentives are better than none, and I think encouraging people to landmark their properties is a great idea. And, Norman and I have already taken advantage of some of the city's incentive programs for downtown redevelopment. We've been very appreciative of that. And if we can somehow extend those kinds of things to homeowners, I think that would be great, and you might see more coming forward to take advantage of those. So, thank you very much, and go for it.
Thank you. Seeing no other public input at this time, I think we're ready to go on with our agenda. Agenda item number 5, ordinance number 2007-09-109, an ordinance amending Schedule J of Section 23-183 of the Urbana Local Traffic Code prohibiting parking at all times on certain streets. Smith Road between Michigan Avenue and Rainbow View, Myra Ridge Drive, north of Windsor Road. Bill.
Thank you. These are two recent Traffic Commission items that were forwarded for council consideration. If there's any questions, I'd be happy to try and answer them.
Are there questions? Seeing no questions, I believe we're ready for a recommendation. Brandon?
Yeah, I'd move that we forward this ordinance to council with a recommendation for approval.
I would second that.
Okay, the motion's been made by Mr. Bowersox and seconded by Mr. Roberts. All those in favor indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Okay, the ayes have it. Now, item number 6, ordinance number 2007-09-1110, an ordinance deleting section 23-38 of the Urbana Local Traffic Code entitled Neighborhood Electric Vehicles and establishing a new section 2338 entitled Neighborhood Vehicles. Bill?
Thank you. What we're looking at doing is expanding the use of these vehicles to include gas-powered vehicles. You may recall earlier this year, the university had requested the use of electric vehicles on University District, city-owned, maintained streets in the University District. And the law recently changed to include gas-powered vehicles. Examples of part of the fleet that the university has for these low-speed type vehicles are attached in your packet. And Pete Varney, on behalf of the university, had contacted us. He's head of their fleet at the U of I, and is asking that we would expand that use to include these vehicles. So the deletion is basically it's a title change to be more inclusive, to include not only electric but gas powered.
Okay. Comments or questions? Danielle?
I would make a motion to send this to council with recommendation for approval.
Okay. There's been a motion by Ms. Chenoweth and a second by Mr. Smythe. All those in favor of this moving this forward ordinance on indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Any nays? Okay, it's going forward. Number 9, resolution number 2007-09-019, R, a resolution approving the purchase of certain real estate with a contribution of tax increment financing funds, 911 North Lincoln Avenue. Libby.
Yes, this resolution would allow the city to work with the Urbana Park District to purchase a house and property at 911 North Lincoln Avenue. This would allow the use of TIF funds for this purchase, and the goal would be to add to King Park. This would be within TIF District Number 3, and one of the things that we seek to do with our TIF districts is to identify and fund Park District projects. So several months ago, this purchase was identified as a project that would be eligible for the use of TIF funds and was consistent with the King Park TIF, King Park Neighborhood TIF District Plan. The Park District, on the city's behalf, has negotiated the purchase with the current owner, and the purchase does respect her timing for collecting her belongings, and we feel that it's a a fair contract. We have this evening the attorney for the Park District here to answer any questions on the contract. The purchase price is $102,000. The budgeted amount already in the budget is $100,000 from TIF 3, and the remainder would be covered by the Park District using other unexpended TIF funds. Any questions?
Dennis?
Once the purchase is finished, Libby, my understanding is that the house will be raised and there'll be basically more space added to the park. Are they looking for a specific improvement in that part of the park?
I don't know of any specific improvement plans other than to add to the acreage of the park and especially the frontage along Lincoln Avenue to improve the visibility. One item is that the land would continue to be owned by the city but would be leased back to the Park District, and there would at some point need to be a right-of-way dedication for purposes of future road widening. In terms of future use of that portion of the park, that would likely be part of future planning efforts for King Park improvements, but I think primarily is to improve configuration of the park and the visibility from Lincoln.
Just continuing a little bit on that, and I'd like to hear Robert's comments too. I know that the neighborhood was hoping eventually to build a community center someplace near King's School and with the assistance of the park department or some such. And this, of course, is totally speculative at this point, but it could be that this property addition to the park might allow in the future a location for such a consideration as amenity to the neighborhood. So it might have some excellent. It might be an excellent location for such a construction in the future someday.
Robert?
I just wanted to comment that the folks that are in the Adopt a Park program in the neighborhood have worked with the Park District for some time on trying to expand the park. They have identified a number of areas where they needed improvement, which they've incorporated into their master planning. And a part of it was expansion, the property expansion, and also being able to provide additional access to the pavilion area. So this is a good thing for the park.
Any other comments, questions? Is there a motion?
Yeah, I would make a motion that we send this with approval forward to City Council.
Second.
Okay, there's been a motion made by Mr. Roberts and it's been seconded by Mr. Lewis. All those in favor of that indicate by saying yes.
Yes.
Or aye.
Or yes.
Yes.
Any opposed? All right, that will move forward to council. Item number 10, ordinance number 2007-09-111, an ordinance amending the Urbana City Code concerning damage to property. Mr. Borden.
The current city ordinance concerning damage to property prohibits the intentional or malicious damage to city property. This proposal would also prohibit the negligent damage to city property, and where it would come in primarily is that much of the damage to city property we see is a result of automobile accidents, and this would allow the police to take enforcement action against uninsured motorists who damage city property. Usually in an accident, we can't prove that that's done intentionally or maliciously, and it's usually not. It's an accident. So this ordinance would allow us to take enforcement action in those cases where it's property is damaged, and we can bring these people into city court and hold them responsible for the damage that they cause. Its primary use will be in cases where the police respond to the scene and the person is unable to show that they have liability insurance. But it could also be used in other cases where police cannot prove an intentional or malicious damaging to city property.
Okay, thank you. Danielle?
Yeah, I have a couple of questions about this. What happens in small claims court if a person can't pay?
Well, if a person can't pay, they've already had a judgment. The judgment's been entered against them.
They're guilty, and they either they can't pay and they don't pay. Those, I guess, are two separate situations.
There are a host of post-judgment collection actions that could be taken in small claims court. For example, the person could be brought into court and could be questioned as to their assets. And if it's determined that they have certain assets, bank accounts and so forth, bank account could be attached. If the person is working, then it's possible that their paycheck could be garnished. So there's just a host of, in some cases, liens can be, a memorandum of judgment could be entered with the county recorder that would attach a lien to any property that they own within the county. These are just general post-judgment options in small claims court. It wouldn't necessarily have to do with this, with an auto accident or anything like that. But there's, I mean, just really half a dozen different kind of standard things that are done in small claims court.
Can they be put in jail?
It is possible to seek a body attachment, but they would not be put in jail. They would not be put in jail. Nobody can be put in jail for non-payment of a debt. What could possibly happen is that a judge could hold somebody in contempt of court.
Which means they didn't appear, for example.
Well, that's one reason that they didn't appear, or the contempt of court could be that they violated a court order, and the court order might be to pay a fine, but they're not being jailed for non-payment. They're being jailed for disobeying a court order.
Okay. Then my second question, follow-up question, is what happens in city court if you can't or don't pay?
Well, in city court, we have fewer options, but essentially somebody who doesn't pay a judgment in city court, we would seek to have a hearing to determine whether they should be held in contempt of court. And if we could get the person to come to the hearing, then a judge would determine whether or not they should be held in contempt of court, and then it would be up to the judge to decide what the punishment would be. If they didn't show up, then we could seek a warrant for their arrest. But again, ultimately, when they come to court, a judge would have to determine what the how to deal with a case where they wouldn't pay a fine.
Okay. So in both cases, you could do a body attachment.
Right. The city court is essentially a civil procedure, so we could seek a body attachment, and it would be up to a judge to approve that.
Okay. So there's another step involved there for the body attachment. It can't just be done in city court.
Right. We'd have to seek in city court. It'd actually be they actually consider that a warrant.
Okay.
Either a warrant for failure to appear or a warrant essentially for contempt of court. But it is. We don't have the power to do that. We can request a warrant from the judge, and the judge would have to make that decision.
And last question, what typically does insurance cover smacking into a tree and damaging the tree, or smacking into a sign and damaging the sign? Is that something that typically vehicle insurance covers? Or is that you have to have kind of special insurance to cover that, and typically people would have to pay out of pocket for those expenses? Typically,
automobile liability insurance would cover that, but the problem that we face is sometimes insurance will not cover, for example, unauthorized drivers. So if you have insurance on your car, but somebody borrows the car, and they get into an accident, sometimes your insurance company won't pay for that. Second case where an insurance company is typically not going to pay for it is in the case of criminal activity. So, for example, somebody who is driving drunk and who runs over a tree. In some cases, the insurance company will say, well, you were committing a criminal offense. That's not what we insured you for, and they won't pay. And then the third situation that the police will run into is there are a number of motorists who drive without liability insurance. And so what happens is when they run into the tree, the police respond to the scene. They don't actually have coverage, and so there's really no. Even if the police write them a citation for going off the roadway, that won't help us recover the losses from the tree, because the traffic court judge will not entertain a motion for restitution.
Okay. I actually have one more question that leads me to, how many cases a year are we talking about where city property is damaged and we can't recover? We have problems recovering it. I mean, what's the scope of the problem?
Well, in my limited time here, I've only been here 4 months, but I can tell you I've probably handled maybe a half a dozen cases so far where we've had to attempt to file cases in city court, or excuse me, in small claims court, to go after people who have been in accidents. We haven't always been successful because in some cases the people, we're not able to locate them. It's a month or two later when we actually try to file suit and we can't find them anymore.
Okay.
But I would say just in my limited experience, I've probably dealt with a half a dozen new cases, and probably in terms of old cases that I've gone back and we're talking about these post-judgment remedies where we try to garnish wages and so forth. Probably another 6 to 10 cases that go back several years where we've been able to get a judgment in small claims court, but we haven't been able to collect on it.
Okay. Yeah, just a comment to the committee. I'm not sure about this. This put up a red flag for me because we have been so critical of nonprofit medical institutions in our community putting body attachments and people for not being able to pay for medical debt, which is considered certainly not within the realm. It's slightly different because it's not necessarily in the realm of their responsibility, although sometimes, accidents happen due to negligence, and this is a similar situation. There's negligence, property is damaged, and so I guess I have concerns about the city being in the business of basically not the issue of garnishing wages or, if people have money in the bank and they refuse to pay, that's fine. But an issue where basically we're, putting a warrant out for someone's arrest because they're considered in contempt of court because they didn't appear, which is actually the thing that happens the most. So this seems like a small thing we're about to do, but actually we need to be thinking about consequences that we're not going to see that result in this, which is people going to jail because they don't appear in court to pay for hitting a sign, etc., because they can't pay, or other issues. So those are my concerns. I guess I just raise them as questions.
Heather, and then Robert.
Danielle, I do agree with you. I think that this just seems so broad, and that if we could say to limit it to the uninsured motorist, because that's a state law, is you have to be an insured motorist to be driving. But I just think to say in any situation in which a person negligently damages or destroys public property, I just think that seems real broad, and I can't support this in this fashion because we all have accidents, but I can support the uninsured motorist part of it because, like I said, that's a state law, and that is negligent. But going beyond that, I think is a real big stretch of the imagination. So.
Robert?
Well, I just wanted to, I reviewed this earlier, and I noticed the provisions where they talked about the parental responsibilities as it relates to minors. So for the general public, I'd like for you to articulate on that, if you would.
In addition to holding people responsible for negligent damage to city property, the proposed ordinance also would provide that a judge could order the responsible party to make restitution to the city. Certainly finding somebody for the action is fine, but what we're really looking for is to be put back in the position where we were before. And I think that the general use of this, although it is written broadly, I think the police department would probably only use this in cases where a person didn't have insurance. But the other part of this ordinance provides that in the case of a minor who causes damage to city property, and that could be intentional damage or malicious damage, the ordinance also provides that the parent or the legal guardian shall be ordered to be jointly responsible for that damage. And the problem that we have with juveniles who commit offenses is that we have very little ability in court to hold them accountable because, for example, we can't compel their parents. If the parents ignore notices to appear in court, the judges will not issue warrants in these cases for minors. So that's the rationale, that if we can hold them, if the minor can be held responsible. And again, this talks about malicious, and also willful, intentional damage too. So that's the rationale.
Dennis, you were going to next, I believe.
Well, the wording of the ordinance is we already have prohibitions against willful and malicious damage. That's my understanding, according to the City Code, Section 1533. And that this ordinance would establish or add offenses for careless or negligent damage. So if we already have damage that is covered, we have an ordinance covering willful and malicious damage, it seems like, okay, that's appropriate. But for accidental damage, it's kind of far-reaching to bring in and make responsible the parents. The only thing that might, the two areas that might be validated, perhaps. One, I think Heather mentioned, the uninsured motorist, because it is state law, and the drunk driver, because you're not supposed to be drinking and driving. And so that's a negligence that can be avoided by self-responsibility. However, there are other instances where you are swerving to not hit a dog in the street or some other such, and you may still find yourself, having an accident, and it might be considered a case of carelessness, but it would certainly be a less onerous example of that kind of damage. So I don't know if we can ferret out or somehow codify in limitations to the clause, but it might, if we want to pass this, we might want to put some reservations on it.
Any other comments or questions or suggestions, Heather?
I guess Dennis really said, we have this Section 1533. I guess I just, again, can't understand, when we have that already, why we have these other sections that are so broad that we can't rewrite this to just have to do with some things that are already state law, such as uninsured motorists and DUI. I just think the other just gets really broad, and you could have parents on vacation and having a child being babysat and, sneaking out a window at night. I guess there's all kinds of things that could happen, and to hold a parent responsible if they were out of town, I think is just, are you going to hold the babysitter accountable? I don't know. I just, I think that, like I said, I can't see supporting something like this tonight. I'd have to see a amended version, highly amended, before I could vote yes.
Any suggestions for moving forward? Seems like there's some changes that, Mayor.
I would think that parents are responsible.
Mm-hmm.
I think parents are on vacation, they're just as responsible as if they're in the house.
I would say that they were being responsible by hiring the babysitter, and that if a child decided to be negligent or malicious, we already have something in place of the willful and malicious damage. Most kids that are going to do something like that are probably of age to get a job anyway.
Danielle?
Well, in response to Lynn's question, we thought this was going to be an easy one, is for us to, I'll say what I would like to see, is that the part about moving it from small claims court to the city court, it's not like we already follow up on this stuff and it goes to small claims court. So it sounds like it's not like we're adding something. Heather and I's concerns aren't necessarily addressed by keeping things as they are, as I hear it. And it also sounds like city court is a place where there's less staff time, and it's more efficient for our staff to move things through city court. So I generally support the idea of increased efficiency, and actually, in some ways, the penalties don't seem to be quite as stiff, like things are kind of easier to process in city court. So I'm interested in moving forward with this, The concern I have is I would support limiting it to a couple of things, or also, my main issue is that I just don't think we should be jailing people for payment, non-payment over what I consider to be fairly minor things. I think that the threshold, like, you really ruin a person's life. They lose their job when you put them in jail. So you actually can't recover any costs from them when they're in jail. And having now worked with folks in jail for 2 years, I begin to see over and over these cases. I mean, I'm talking to women who are in jail on weekends because they aren't able to pay their traffic tickets and they have to pay the babysitter. And it's gotten stupid, basically, is what it is. So if we could say, basically, we'll pursue it to this level and stop, and it's not our policy to pursue it into jail, that would actually take care of my concern. And it sounds like maybe some other limitations would address that concern. But I do think we should pass something like this and move it into city court.
What if we ask Mr. Borman to take this back and having heard our concerns, and let's maybe postpone this until 2 weeks from tonight, the next committee of the whole, where he can bring it back reworked a bit and maybe speak specifically with some of those of you who have some strong feelings about this. What do you think?
I think that seems acceptable to me.
Could I have a motion to that?
So move.
I don't think I can make the motion.
So moved.
You got it. Who's the seconder?
I will.
Okay. So our plan will be then to hear back from you in a couple weeks with a kind of a reworked motion, and we'll postpone it for 2 weeks until from tonight. Make sense? Okay. All right. Thank you. All right. That takes us to item number 7, discussion of historic preservation incentives. We have some public comment, 3 individuals, but why don't we first hear from staff, and then we'll hear our public comment. Is that acceptable to those who wish to speak? Okay, thank you.
Good evening. You have a memo before you on historic preservation incentives. This memo came out of originally the joint meeting on February 7th, 2007, of the Historic Preservation Commission and the Urbana City Council. We then had another discussion on April 23rd at the Committee of the Whole meeting, where we further discussed incentives for historic preservation. And now we're looking at it again following direction from the previous meetings, which were to look at better ways of educating the public about historic preservation and the history of Urbana, examining the incentive programs discussed at the former meeting, and investigating specifically the revolving loan program used in Eugene, Oregon. So the memo you have in front of you discusses education programs such as historic markers, and includes a permit fee waiver program, landmark recognition programs, and a revolving loan program. The first programs discussed are the historic markers, and 2 programs were looked into. The first one was somewhat non-conventional, small, small markers that would be on residential properties, giving information about the architecture and the history of the houses. And staff looked at that and thought that those markers, that there were some issues with those markers that... Sorry. Right, sorry.
Just
better?
Yeah, give it a try. Let's see.
Hello? Better?
Much
Yes.
better.
Okay, yeah, sorry.
Great.
It was just
Sorry.
Would
you say your name first?
Right, Rebecca
Rebecca.
Bird, intern in the Planning Department Division. So the Historic Homes marker program, the concerns we had were about consistency of appearance, difficulty of administration, and possible sign pollution. And staff believes that the existing landmark plaque program is sufficient to recognize our local residential landmarks and districts in a manner that is tasteful and does not detract from the property. The second program we looked at were for non-residential properties, and they were similar to Councilmember Bowersox's proposal for historic marker program. Those were bronze plaques, or generally they're made from bronze plaques. They can also be cast aluminum. And staff feels that if sufficient funds could be identified to support it, that we would be supportive of such a historic marker program, and that if we worked in conjunction with the Historic Preservation Commission and other groups, we could identify properties that should be marked in such a way. We also have applied for Looking for Lincoln Wayside exhibit that's mentioned in the memo, and we just heard actually today that we probably did receive that. Our application was accepted. Going on to the landmark recognition incentive programs, the first one of those programs is the Historic Landmark Building Permit Fee Waiver, and that's a program that the city would waive all building permit fees for individually listed local landmarks or buildings that are contributing to a local historic district. And staff is supportive of the waiver for locally recognized historic properties and districts, and that waiver could be applied administratively during the remainder of 2007 to 2008, and then documented in the next published edition of the fee schedule. The next program discussed is a property tax rebate, and Councilmember Roberts initially suggested this, where we would offer a rebate of 25% on the city's share of assessed property taxes on any property in Urbana that applies for and receives local landmark designation. The rebate would be applied only in the first year, and would continue for 3 years. And staff feels that a property tax rebate program would need to be tied to specific improvements and made non-regressive with respect to income. The Historic Landmark Recognition Grant program would provide a small grant to acknowledge property owners who apply for and receive local landmark status. This would require an annual budget, recommended is $5,000, and in the first year we could grant $1,000 to the first 5 property owners whose property gained landmark status. And if city funds could be identified, staff would be supportive of such a program. The next program is the Historic Rehabilitation Revolving Loan Program. Staff feels that this would require additional analysis and discussion, as a program like this would require a significant amount of staff time to establish and administer effectively. It would also require a significant amount of seed money along with an annual budget. And we don't feel that we know enough about a program like that at this point. And then 2 last points are mentioned in the memo. One is supporting legislation that has been proposed to improve the federal rehabilitation tax credit, and the other is to consider adding staff to provide additional support for historic preservation activities. If you have any questions, I think Robert and I are both here to answer them.
Thank you, Rebecca. Danielle?
On the issue of staff, it's unclear to me what level of staff we have currently. I know that you're an intern who's done a lot of work on historic preservation, and that's very much appreciated. What's the current staffing structure for historic preservation in community development, so that we kind of understand any new proposals in relation to that?
Over the past several years, we've had an intern work primarily on historic preservation issues with oversight from the planning manager. So, for instance, over the past year, Rebecca Bird has been working largely on historic preservation issues. During the summer, Rebecca worked almost full-time, and now during the fall semester, she's working many fewer hours, maybe 10 hours a week. And so the amount of manpower that we're able to devote has varied over the course of the year. We've had very good work taking place with the interns that we've had several years. It's helpful when there's continuity, of course, from year to year, and but obviously there's going to be good oversight for all of that work as well.
Let's see if I had any other questions. I did just have one other question, which is, I really appreciated this memo because it kind of laid out in a very factual basis what our options were, and it was very easy to kind of look through and see. And I agree with a lot of the concerns that staff raised on some of the issues. In particular, the thing I agree with the most is the regressiveness of the tax rebate concept, where if we don't, where richer people get a bigger break if it's based on a percentage, and that there's no incentive to fix up a property with just a flat tax rebate. And actually the worst case scenario, and I don't think any of the council members want to face this, is that basically a government handout goes to a dilapidated structure that like no one is proud of, and there's no incentive there to actually fix it up. I don't like that, and I don't think that we should go in that direction. The question is, I like the historic recognition idea because it's clean. Like sometimes I think we try so hard to be fair that we stack up staff time, and so we end up having these really complicated structures when actually let's just give someone $3,000 if they do the historic and like call it quits, so to speak. The thing is I'd like to tie it to incentive to invest, and so I guess I'm just curious to hear from our expert staff what they think about the following option, which is, what if we do the historic recognition grant that we're talking about and basically tie it to receipts? And we say, you have 2 years or 3 years, however long we want to give, you have X number of years, you bring in all your receipts at once, it can be up to $3,000, you get a single check, and we say it's, it's competitive, meaning the first 5 properties that designate historic in the year get this, so that we kind of have a race for people to do this, and we kind of ramp up the bars, so to speak. So I guess I'd like to know what your input on that is, and in particular, just to clarify, the checks would be for the reimbursement, so to speak, would be for receipts on appearance, safety, structure, and or if they wanted to purchase a marker or do some kind of artistic thing to mark their property, all those kinds of things would be eligible. And I'd be open to other things that would be eligible, but basically kind of tying it to things that are improvements to the building in some way.
Certainly most of the programs that I saw were tied to an incentive. None of them were simply for landmarking.
I like the idea of a recognition grant because it's clean in that it helps recognize for property owners. It's clear what the rules are. There's not much ambiguity. This as an alternative is a possibility as well. We'd have to look into it a little bit more, but one thing that I would want to think about is if you gave the impression to people that they would be getting $3,000 at the end of the thing, and if there was and it turns out that it was a competitive process, and at the end they didn't actually get the $3,000, and they were really counting on that money to help pay back the contractors, and you know what I'm saying. But
in terms of timing, actually, it'd be the first 5 in, and then they would have that opportunity. So, yeah, I think we could basically designate you're one of the folks in the queue.
Oh, I see.
So to speak. If they don't spend it, they don't spend it.
Okay.
And actually, I don't know if I was looking, it said 3,000 to 5,000. You were actually looking at that as an annual budget. We should talk about what the amount is. It shouldn't be, I think, more than 3, but, and no less than 1,000.
Tying to investment is actually, as Rebecca said, the more common way to do incentives. But there is some merit to just to say, as an incentive to get more people to apply, just to say, if you apply and you succeed, here's a small grant in recognition of that.
Go ahead, Dennis.
Well, actually, I was going to ask are we going to be continuing basically having open debate or discussion now, or are we
Right.
going to have public input? I think we should
Now,
have
if we had any
public
questions
input.
for Rebecca, and if there are
Okay.
none specific for her right now, why don't we go ahead and have public input?
Well, concerning Rebecca's statement so far and Danielle's question, I am interested in finding out specifically if we have a part-time staff person dedicated to historic preservation questions on staff at this time. Is that basically Rebecca's position? You're a part-time are you a half-time employee?
15 hours a week right now.
15 hours a week. It's not quite half-time.
No.
And you're not, your workload isn't necessarily always on historic preservation. You have other
Actually, it has
assignments?
been. No, I think
It's
it
been-
has been solely historic preservation.
Okay, but I just thought it was said that, well, maybe it's because of your your class schedule that you have fewer hours to devote to it, correct? Okay, well, that's something I want to talk about, too.
Thank you, Rebecca. Mayor?
One question. Do you have results from other cities on how these different incentives work, which seems to be most effective? Are people happy once they put these investment incentives in, that they've achieved their goal?
Most of the communities that I spoke to didn't compare one program to another because each of the programs are so different and they target something different. And no one really told me that any of their programs were negative, but I'm not sure that they would.
Robert?
In terms of the other cities that you looked at, what was the maximum amount of incentive given? And the least amount of incentive given in terms of funds?
It was quite common to have a grant, a matching grant or loan program that would go up to $20,000 or $30,000. Some of them were higher than that. Most of them had a minimum of kind of $5,000.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. Thanks again. Mr. Adams, would you like to come forward, please, and state your name and address and limit your remarks to 5 minutes, if you would?
My name's Brian Adams. I live at 412 West Elm Street in Urbana, and I just wanted to just make a general comment that I support these incentives, and I think that they're very important, and that I would urge the City Council to consider them carefully and to support them. I think that in order to push forward historic preservation issues in Urbana, we do need to have some sort of incentives to encourage people to do these sorts of things. Recently in the News Gazette there were 2 articles which kind of surprised me about the amount of money other communities put into things like preservation. There was a recent article about work in Danville where it said that the city of Danville contributes $130,000 annually to preservation issues. And then there was another article about in Champaign, some of the renovations that are going on downtown get $100,000 from the city of Champaign. So I don't know the specifics of how that money, where that money comes from and how it's distributed, but the point was that other communities close by seem to be concerned enough about preservation to have these sorts of monetary incentives, and I would just hope that Urbana could also go in that direction too, to help us and help people that are interested in preserving the history that's still here in terms of our architecture and our historical structures. I know a lot of times we're shown this brochure about historic Urbana, and I think there's some interesting information in here, but there's a lot of inaccurate information in here. I think that we can do better in this city about our history and learning about our history and telling people about our history. So I think I just would again urge the council to consider these things carefully and help us to preserve, those of us who are interested to preserve our history. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Ilona Markowski. I live at 412 West Elm, Urbana, and I'm here to support the incentives. I think this is the first time in Urbana's history that we actually have such proposals and we are discussing them, and I think this is great and fantastic that we have finally gotten to this point. And there are several points, several incentives. I would also like to urge the City Council to accept the proposals for incentives. It's really necessary. There are a lot of people here who are interested in preservation, and without financial incentives, it's very hard to do historic preservation, very discouraging for people who are doing it, not having any incentives. One thing I would like to point out, we have to be a little bit careful when we give incentives to landmark properties. As we know, we just landmarked 2 properties on Elm Street against the owner's will, and if they are eligible for these incentives as owners of landmark buildings, we have to think about whether these incentives should go to them, as they were not the people who asked for landmarking the buildings. In fact, they were against landmarking the buildings. So we have to carefully consider how the buildings or districts, whatever, were landmarked. If landmarking goes against the owner's wishes, I find it difficult to give them support later on to fix up those buildings. I would give these incentives to people who are seeking out themselves the landmarking of their buildings. I think the incentives are very small as proposed. I think it would be nice to have higher amounts. For example, as Brian Adams mentioned earlier, Champaign is currently providing $100,000, and this is going to one single property owner in downtown Champaign to fix up an old business building. So one person can get this much money. It's pretty nice and very large sum, and here we are proposing very much smaller amounts for many people. So I think the incentives should be large enough to actually be effective. So I'm in support of all incentives proposed with the caveats that I have mentioned. Thank you.
Thank you. Catherine Anthony. Thank you. If you'd state your name again and your address, and keep your remarks to 5 minutes.
Yeah, I didn't have any formal planned remarks for today, but I just want to speak in favor briefly. Catherine Anthony, 309 West Pennsylvania Avenue in Urbana. I don't know all the details of the proposal, but just generally speaking, would support any efforts to enhance historic preservation here in Urbana. We have a lot of beautiful buildings, I think, that we've seen go, many of us, during the times that we've been here. And it's part of our history that's lost and can never be recovered. I used to serve, I was the chair of the campus committee on historic sites at the University of Illinois when we had such a committee, and we were very attuned to this issue on campus. I think we need to be similarly attuned to the issue here in town, both in our commercial areas and also in the residential areas. And when we look at the places and spaces that people love the most in the United States, it's often those places where there is that strong sense of attachment and nostalgia to the past that once gone can never be recaptured. So I would second what our previous speaker said, and perhaps any and all incentives, the maximum that is economically feasible, we should consider. And if you as a city council can make a major dent in this issue, I think it'd really be a great legacy to be able to leave. I've lived in Urbana for, 23 years now, and always amazed at the fact that we haven't been as attuned to this issue as I think we should be. So I'm glad to see it being discussed, and I support it wholeheartedly.
Okay, thank you. Lois Steinberg?
I didn't want to speak. I'm just in support of
Okay, all right, thank you. All right, any other public input? If not, I think we're ready for further discussion. Dennis, and then Robert.
Well, the memorandum that was created for us, dated September 6th, on some of the suggestions that I put forward in a memo concerning ideas to create incentives for historic preservation in the city, I think is a well thought out and digested commentary on some of the ideas that came from not only those suggestions, but also our joint meeting with the Historic Preservation Commission and other recommendations. I think it is important that the time has come to do some significant legislation here in the city that would establish a means to both recognize those who are working on efforts to preserve the historic nature and fabric of our city, and to encourage people to step forward in the individual landmarking process of their homes or their properties. We have had the loss of quite a few important structures, or the threatened loss of quite a few important structures in our town, and I think it behooves us to try to preserve what we can while we do still have it. So the memorandum that was provided by the city staff I think is extremely useful for our discussion, and we'll be having a lot of discussion, I'm sure, tonight. Maybe I'll just run through it with some of my thoughts. First of all, I want to say that I was really enheartened by how many positive comments this staff was able to put together and present on the various ideas presented here. I think we do have an agreement that the Historic House and Marker Program has validity. I think it's important to be able to visually locate and celebrate the homes that are important to us in our community. So there is already a process of funding through the Historic Preservation Commission for signage in the Historic Preservation Ordinance. And so the manner of funding such a marker program, I'm sure, would probably work hand in hand with their goals as well. So I'm imagining that there is a means to carry forth that program. The particular type of signage that might be agreed upon to mark the homes, well, we've had some examples that were researched by Brandon Barsocks in his proposal. The staff has presented some typical plaquing sizes and designs. And also we've heard a comment from Danielle Chenoweth that the process of marking the signs may become involved in a more artistic approach that would be allow the community to express itself in an artistic manner as well as an aesthetic one and a historic one. So the particular kinds of signage that we settle upon, I think we can probably figure that out in the future. I think we should set aside, or we should agree to set aside the money that is designated for the Historic Preservation Commission use of making markers, and we should begin to do it because, after all, we do have some important historic celebrations coming up in the near future. If the city felt that it would like to advance that project and set aside $5,000 or $10,000 in the budget for next year to accomplish that goal, I would feel that it was a very significant contribution as a line item, for $5,000 to $10,000. So, I mean, that would be the next year's budget. I think we should consider it. And actually, I think, in general, I'm just going to say this now, that okay, if we really believe in the process of historic preservation, I think we need to support it not only with words, but also financially. I think that it would be useful to have on staff, since we're about to, I assume, experience a a flurry of interest in landmark possibilities, and we're also getting ready for 2 historic celebrations in the near future concerning the city's birthday and Lincoln's birthday. That maybe it's a time to have probably we are not going to be able to afford a full-time staff person, but a dedicated half-time staff individual as a part of the city staff to handle the various projects that are going to come up concerning historic preservation and the handling of and the assigning of grant monies and coordinating activities, financial activities in what could become projects for revolving loans, application procedures, and similar projects that would probably take too much staff time unless we had a dedicated individual.
Robert?
I just wanted to say that I really appreciate the effort that went into this proposal and the kinds of incentives that exist, potentially exist. But I think the dialogue that has to take place now is the dialogue about how serious we are about historical preservation and what kind of image we want to project for the city of Urbana. And if we are serious about our historical background and the correlation of that to our arts program, we need to have the dialogue about financing and how far we can go with it. And I think we need to build into the budgets in the near future the necessary dollars to make it well worthwhile to get involved in it. And I can only say at this point, 5,000 to 10,000 is not enough. And based on my understanding of basic construction costs today, I can see where if you got in a building downtown Urbana that was basically a brick structure, if you did that today, it's going to cost you anywhere from $125 to $130 a square foot. So that's part of reconstruction, and so it's not a simple process in terms of dollars. But I think we have to have that dialogue and find out where can we extract those dollars and put our money where our mouth is. Thanks.
Brandon?
Yeah, thank you, staff, for bringing these forward, and Dennis and everybody for pushing these items onto our agenda here. I like the recommendations that were on page 8 of the memo. There were 7 recommendations that city staff gave for how we move forward, and I'm generally supportive of all of them, and at some point tonight would hope to support a motion that we could send all these back to staff to start working on and bring ordinances for. I have 2 comments. One of the issues is whether or not the Historic Landmark Recognition Grant would be automatic or would be tied to some improvements. And I would vote for option 4 over option 3. That I do agree with Danielle, Alona's comments, the comments of others last time we met on this topic, that we really should be tying whether it's a tax rebate or this recognition grant to specific improvements and not automatically giving it to everyone. So in the list of 7, I'd support moving ahead with all of them and picking 4 over 3 in that choice. The other comment about staffing levels is just that I have, at least in my time on council, and actually since my time getting involved in the old downtown strategic plan process, seen that the planning division is the division in this city that is the most sort of overworked but the most graceful in handling the volume of cases that we send their way. The planning division has done an amazing job at keeping all the balls in the air and keeping everything juggling despite the increased amount of growth, the huge projects we have going on in this city that weren't happening a few years ago, and the increasing number of cases they get. So to me, we've not added really to the size of the city staff here in our 3 budgets that we've done so far, other than to add 5 police officers. And I supported that, and that priority was, I think, right at the time. I think we added maybe 1 position in the library, and there were some other very small changes. But basically, we've held the line on the size of everything despite the growth of the city. And at this point, the next staff person that I would like to see us consider adding is more positions in the planning division. I think we're going to continue to see this level of economic development. That's what we want. That's the top of our agenda. And we have to give our staff the tools to meet that demand that we keep sending their way. And this division has, worked under our increasing workload very well, and it's finally time for them to have the resources they need to give all of this attention. A couple examples, they did the comprehensive plan in-house. We wrote that in-house without using consultants a few years ago. They did a tremendous, tremendous job. Our staff did writing it. And Lynn, I think you might have served on the advisory commission. It took a couple years more than we thought it would. And I think we burnt some people out and worked really hard trying to get that thing done. Yeah, it was the 2003 plan, then it was the 2004 plan, and then we passed it in 2005, and it was the 2005 plan. And we did a great job. We wrote an amazing plan that got awards. But I think at the same time, we really taxed our staff. And I think that's why when we wrote our council goals 2 years ago, we put in that note about when we wrote in our council goals about rewriting some of the zoning ordinance, we said, let's hire outside people. We really were sensitive even 2 years ago to the fact that planning division was already really stretched to the max. And so I just want to say that I hope in next year's budget, and I hope as the mayor considers what is even possible and brings us a budget next May, that this division, the planning division, is one that we look for. If there's any way to increase staff anywhere in the city, look for increasing staff and doing something like giving a half or full-time historic preservation planner position and making sure we have enough staff to handle all the development and the growth and look after historic preservation.
Do we have other comments before we have a motion? Dennis?
I wanted to just add that one of the suggestions that I made was in my memos to the city and the council persons was that we could very easily take the permit fees that we receive every year from demolition of homes, and that has added up to several $1,000s a year, and we could transfer that proceeds that come into the city and budget it specifically for historic preservation purposes, still setting aside a certain amount of money for administrative costs. Originally, I had proposed 40% of the demolition permit fee income might be earmarked for preservation. To me, it seems, the perfect solution to find funding within our own budget for preservation is the very the projects that are threatened. And Danielle suggested that was too small an amount, and she would suggest 80% of the permit fee income be earmarked for preservation. So as we may want to indeed set aside line item income specifically for this project, but I would suggest that the city take this available resource already and use it for the purpose of preservation. Whatever projects that we choose to initiate.
Mayor?
I would just like to say that whatever income we get from fees is already in the budget. So I think it would be a mistake to tie this to demolition fees. You're talking about spending a significant amount of money. I mean, if you talked about $10,000, I'm sure we could do that, but we have to look and see what is the right amount, and we might want to start out small, but we have to look at the total budget picture, because if you say that's available money, it really isn't available because we've budgeted all the spending, so you might have to cut back on someplace else, but the ideal thing would be additional revenues. And so I wouldn't tie it to one thing.
Well, and Mayor, when you say additional revenues, are you talking about
revenue growth?
Created?
New things happen, you never know.
You never know.
Right, but I'm saying I wouldn't, since the budget is balanced now, you can't really say, here's a piece of revenue that we can dedicate to a new expenditure.
All right.
Because it is balanced right now.
Okay.
I'm going to call on myself and turn it over to Heather for just a moment, if the council will allow me. Lynn, thank you. I'd like to agree with the mayor. While I am supportive of moving these incentives along, I think we need to take an incremental approach in terms of funding them. I don't think we can just, move, just right ahead and do 10, 15,000 even. I think we just need to be very thoughtful about it, because I think, just as you said, right now this money, it would be new money that we need to come up with. And so I think we just need to, next year when we look at the budget, figure that out, because there's all kinds of competing goals that we have in terms of the use of those funds. And so I think we just need to keep that in mind. And of course, with increased economic development, increased growth, hopefully we'll be in a position where we can begin, to provide incentives that are more meaningful in future years. So, thank you, and I'll take it back. Thank you very much. Danielle.
Let me take a crack at making a motion that I think includes what has been said. Heather, do you want to speak first before I make a motion that ties things up?
sorry.
Go ahead.
I guess I half-heartedly, I guess if you can't split a baby, but I don't like the idea of historic preservation incentives if they're not brought to the council by the owners of the properties. I could support incentives if the historic preservation idea was brought to us by the owner of the property. But I just have a really hard time with the city council saying, yep, let's mark this historic, and your hands are tied as a property owner. I don't want to be told what I can do or what I can't do with my property, what I've put my money into, what I've worked hard to have. And if I want to have it demolished, that's my money. And I don't think anyone, including the city council, should be able to tell me or anybody else what to do with their property and their money that they have tied into something. And that's why I have a really hard time with a historic preservation idea to begin with, unless it's brought to us by the property owners.
Charlie?
Well, I think the idea here is to go after incentives that would encourage the owner to do it. So I think we're probably on the same page. The thing I think we probably need to consider in here, I'm attracted to the idea of maybe possibly two kinds of programs, a small grant program, you know, $1,000, $2,000, $3,000 that sort of, you know, yes, you've gone out and done some work on your property, and it's the item 3 here aspect of it, but I'm also attracted to a much bigger program of possibly doing something similar to what we do with downtown. We do have an incentive program for downtown, and I thought maybe Tom or Libby could describe that real quickly, how that works, and maybe in there is an idea of how we might get an approach to maybe a bigger matching grant type program. I'd like to see us to do, you know, we've got other communities to do $10,000, $20,000, $30,000 matching grants. That might be another aspect of this that we could go after, and maybe Libby or Tom have some ideas, and maybe we just hear how we do it in the TIF districts.
Sure. Well, right now, our TIF RIP program, which is primarily active downtown, but we have a similar program in the Philo Road area, includes point systems for eligibility and historic preservations within those points, as well as consistency with the downtown plan. And the way it works is per address, we do an interest write-down for a $60,000 loan plus a 10% grant, which would be $6,000, and the grant is based on those points. We do try to leverage that if we have multiple addresses, for example, and it's been successful. If you look downtown, most of these significant buildings have been recipients of TIF RIP for the buildings and for tenants, and it's been a very important program for business and for historic preservation. So it is significant. It's not as huge, granted, as what City of Champaign's been able to do, but we did increase it, and we try to be competitive. Some of the historic buildings that have benefited recently would be the building where Crane Alley is. The Cinema Gallery building has a TIF RIP loan, Mirabelle's building, the Stevens building, and Lincoln Square is actually on the National Register, and we have a development agreement. So we do TIF RIP administratively, and we have development agreements for larger types of projects. Anything else on TIF RIP, Tom?
No, the only thing I would add is that the theory behind the TIF RIP program is that by incentivizing investment in a property, you are increasing property values, and down the road, over the years, that money investment that the city is making will be recouped in additional property tax revenues. So that's the theory of the TIF RIP, and I suppose you could extrapolate that to historic preservation, in that if you're incentivizing investment in a historic property, you are thereby increasing property values, and over the years you are recouping an investment. It might be a little unusual to couple a TIF RIP type investment with a property tax abatement But I suppose if that property tax abatement is limited in the length of time, again, it may take a little longer to recoup your investment, but over the years, that investment can be recouped. So it is possible to kind of couple those two programs, but it may take a little bit longer to recoup your investment. But that's the theory in the TIF-RIP program.
Dennis?
So concerning that, it's easy to picture it for commercial properties in the downtown area. How would it work for individual homeowners scattered throughout East Urbana or West Urbana?
Well, do
we have to create a district within which this would occur?
The challenge, and this would be a little bit different in that you don't have many single-family residences within our TIF districts.
Right.
Our TIF districts are primarily commercial, some mixed use, maybe some higher density residential, but there probably aren't very many single-family homes within most of our TIF districts. So there might not be as much of an opportunity to use a TIF-type incentive for historic preservation. And if it's very burdensome and difficult to create new TIF districts specifically related to residential TIFs. So if the question is, can we use TIF incentives for single-family historic preservation, the opportunities are limited. And the opportunities to create additional TIF districts are also limited. But there are opportunities for the city to fund TIF-type incentives outside of TIF districts, but the city bears the entire cost of that, as opposed to within the TIF, you spread that burden over the various taxing agencies. So.
But to continue, but it seems like the only way that we can actually successfully engage individual homeowners over the wider neighborhood area to engage, to do the preservation work that is really the goal of most of the incentives that are being proposed here. These incentives are not really so much aimed at the commercial district of the downtown, because they already have a means to achieve restoration processes. But we're looking at ways that individual houses within our neighborhoods can achieve this. Now, I would probably support some kind of structure, if the city could, create it, that would be somewhat based on property tax incentives over increasement over a long period of time, which was a TIF-oriented sort of structure, as long as it was not too cumbersome. And it might be that we could, use if it required boundaries or some such. I'm sure we could. I mean, I'm wondering if the proposed Royer east and west neighborhood downtown area or expanse might be a suitable delineated section to use to focus the attention on preservation objectives. And if we adopted the Royer art and architectural heritage area, or whatever you want to call it, we could actually use that structure to apply for matching grants, could we not? I mean, it would be a defined area that would have a specific use or goal for restoration and appreciation and tourism. There would probably be some ways of garnering matching funds that could be used specifically for restoration of individual properties within that area. So I don't know. I mean, I'm thinking about how to link a lot of these things together.
Danielle?
Let me try and make a motion. Except Charlie just took my motion. Hold on. So the motion is that I'd like to make is, so we have something on the table to discuss that's concrete, is that we do number one, and with the caveat that we look at ties to artists or local foundries playing a role in this marker program. The second is that we establish a historic landmark building permit fee waiver. The third is that we ask staff to come back to us with a grant and possibly loan program that is A, tied to improvements, B, easy and clear and doesn't take a lot of staff time, C, consider a small grant component and a larger matching grant that's actually very similar to what we have with our TIF, a small grant without any match and a larger that could be a match, and that we explore the loan program further as recommended by staff. So this motion would not establish this, but it would ask staff to come back with something more defined with those parameters. If it's still relevant, that we go ahead and send a letter of support, that would be, number 6 would be supportive of that. And number 7 would be for us to basically state our opinion that we know that CD has staffing concerns, and I don't actually want to stipulate exactly what staff member they should get, but I'd be interested to hearing from CD in terms of what they feel their current needs are. So that basically, as we look into the next year, we consider what the staffing needs are in the Community Development Commission that would accomplish these programs and also look at other staffing needs they may have.
So to recap the generalities of that, or is there more?
So the recap, we basically do something with all 7. We do 1 with the arts, 2 as it is, 3, 4, and 5, we basically say come back with an idea that's tied to improvements, is easy and clear, consider a small grant and a large match, and explore the loan component. We send the letter, and we ask CD, what's your opinion in terms of what staffing it's going to take to get this done?
Okay. All right, so there's a motion on the table. Is there a second?
Second.
Okay, second by Mr. Smythe. Now, I have a comment here. These, so what we're expecting back at next week's council would be motions that would relate to all of these.
Actually, can I clarify that my motion is to send it to committee?
So 2 weeks.
And as long as staff feels like that's sufficient time, I guess that's a question for you, Libby, is, do you think it should be 4 weeks or 2 weeks?
We'll, if we can schedule it and calendar it, but soon, we'll come back soon. Maybe not the next committee, but possibly the following. And
So let me clarify with my motion that it be brought back in a timely manner to us at
a committee. Okay.
And
Thank
I
you.
also want to clarify with my motion that I support what Heather said in terms of that this would be an application process. It's not like we throw incentives at people. If they want it, they would apply for that.
Okay. All right, Dennis and then Heather.
And maybe I'd like to ask a clarification. As far as number 4 goes, is the motion include a study or a recommendation about a partial tax abatement from the city's share of property tax, as long as it's specifically tied to improvements? That seems appropriate to me, but I'm just clarifying.
A tax abatement based on improvements? Well, I guess to answer your question, that would be one thing to consider. I want the most simplest way to administer it. So if abating taxes is very simple, then let's do that. But if writing a check when you have receipts in hand is simpler, I prefer to go with that, and it doesn't necessarily need to be tied to tax abatements.
Okay, Heather,
thank you.
Heather, and then the mayor.
And I guess the reason I brought up that the reason for halfway supporting the incentives is because we had 502 and 504, whatever, East Elm, and they were ready for basically demolition. The property owners had looked into having the homes restored and how much it would cost, and it wasn't feasible for them. And so that's why I bring it up. It was that they basically were asked, told what they could or couldn't do, instead of being acknowledged that they had looked into, and they had people here saying this is what it would cost, and then they were basically, they were told, well, too bad, we're going to do this anyway, and that's why I have a problem with it.
Mayor?
I think it's, I agree with what Danielle said about it should be simple. And I think that if you just give people a check because they've invested in the property, that's better than having a bunch of little teeny things. And I think if you're going to do tax abatements, that gets very complicated and very expensive. So I agree that we should do the cleanest, simplest thing that's gives them the biggest amount of money in one lump.
Okay, Heather has a question.
Robert, do you have any idea, Robert Myers, what they do in Savannah, Georgia? I know they have a quite large historic
Sure.
district, and but I don't believe that it's. I think that there's a whole lot more involved than just like little things like this, and I just wonder how much you know about it.
Well, I'm not super familiar with Savannah, other than I know that they have a blending of programs. They have historic districts and historic landmarks. They have some incentives. I can find out exactly what they do have. They also have some funding through their federally funded rehabilitation, although that gets complicated when you do that. And I know that firsthand. But we can find out more specifically if you'd like that information.
Well, I guess the reason I would is, I hear that keeping things historic and preserving the history helps with tax building. But I guess I would like to see what or tourism and how it brings tourists in. Right. I know that Savannah has a lot of their tourism comes because people come to their historic district, but I don't believe that it's funded the same way that we're looking at funding. I believe that there's a lot more to it, and that you're not tying property owners' hands. And as such, they have groups of people who actually, a commission or something like that looks for funding and stuff like that. So
providing more incentives
exactly.
rather than the carrot rather than the stick, so to speak.
Exactly. So I'd like to look into what Savannah does if we're actually wanting people to come here for tourism of the Royer District or whatever that might look like in the big picture in the end. Let's look at what Savannah, Georgia is doing, because I know that they do have a large tourism for the historic properties.
Okay, we have a motion on the table, and there's been a second, and there's been some clarification. Are we ready for a vote? Yeah. All right. All those in favor of what's on the table, please indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, that motion carries. Let's go on with discussion item number 8, demolition review for protecting historic resources. And will that be Robert? Okay.
Historic agenda tonight. Oh, that's okay. That's our job. Be in the hot seat. It was requested that city staff look specifically at demolition review as a tool for saving historically significant properties. And in particular, Dennis Roberts has submitted a proposal for demolition review, again, as a specific tool for saving historic properties. And just so people get a sense of the issue at hand, the city issues about 28 demolition permits per year based on the average from 2000 to 2006, and that includes residential properties, commercial properties, industrial properties, properties on the fringes of the city, property in the central city, in neighborhoods, corridors. It could be for a shed. It could be for a school addition. It could be for all kinds of things other than from the university. So specifically, I wanted to direct your attention to 2 city staff reports or memos that we provided in your packet, one dated September 6th and one dated September 20th, which is, the second one is a supplemental memo that we thought would be helpful for you. I think I'd like to preface this by saying that probably everyone in the room here has the same goal in terms of protecting historic resources. That's an assumption of mine. that everyone in the room has basically the same goal. But the question is, how do you do it, and what's the best way to do it? And so that's really what we're talking about here tonight. This particular tool, let me go over real quickly just explain what they are. Demolition delay. We're defining this as a delay of a demolition permit application for a set period of time to provide a chance to explore alternatives for demolition, including possibly selling the property. In other words, a permit's applied for, you have to, there's a timeout for, let's just say, 30 days. People can approach the property owner and make an offer for purchase, for instance, or there may be other alternatives as well. People may provide some ideas that may be helpful for that the property owner hadn't thought about. But in the end, demolition delay, most of the communities that have this provision, at the end of that delay period, the applicant can still choose to go through with the demolition if they choose to. Having said that, there are some cities where this demolition delay ordinance, during that delay, someone can apply for historic landmark, make a historic landmark application, which may ultimately lead to the protection of that property. So the positives of this approach is that it does offer a cooling off period during which proposals can be made, and it's easier to administer than demolition review, which I'll talk about in just a second. The other positive thing is it does have more predictable outcome for the applicants themselves. They have a better sense of what would happen at the end of that delay period. Now, the negatives, we believe, the city staff believes, there's a less predictable outcome for the city and the public. In other words, we go through the process. At the end of the delay process, the property may still be torn down. That's a very distinct possibility. And in fact, in many cities, the vast majority of the properties at the end of the demolition delay period, they're still torn down. That's except for those that allow the landmark application during the demolition delay period. Having said that, it may create a false impression in the public that historic resources are protected. And then it also sets up an expectation that someone will always step in to negotiate an alternative to a demolition, which may not always be the case. So there may be an expectation that there's lots of additional work to do. That additional work may not necessarily be a transparent process either. You may be talking about contacting the property owner, meeting them to make discussions. Well, this is not necessarily out in the open, and it's not necessarily a transparent process for the public. Demolition review, how we're defining it versus demolition delay. Demolition review, we define this as a public review process that's triggered when demolition permits are applied for. In this public review process, you determine whether or not the demolition permit should be issued based on whether or not the property is historically significant. And there's more explanation of this in your staff memos, but I guess a positive aspect of demolition review, it does have more predictable outcomes than demolition delay for the city and the public. That more predictable outcome is that historic resources that are identified, it's more often are protected in the end. The negative, unfortunately, there's a number of significant negative problems with this particular tool. It's much less predictable outcome for the applicants to the point of causing what I would call real uncertainty in the real estate market. It's much more costly to administer than demolition delay, and you'll see it in our supplementary memo that in our best estimate, if we did a full-blown demolition delay for every demolition application, that it would increase plan cases by about 35%. And so it would cost about $125,000 a year, we believe, if we did a full-blown review and turned each demolition case into a plan case that needed to go before a commission or board and go through the process. There's also some pretty serious legal concerns that we have with respect to regulatory takings. Obviously, we want to avoid any sort of claim of regulatory taking of property without just compensation. And we also raised the issue of if everything goes through the process, you are in fact spending a lot of manpower and resources, not only on the properties in the inn that may be important historic properties in the inn that may be protected, but also ones that are not preservation priorities. In other words, you're spending time evenly among all the properties and not focusing your resources on the properties that mean the most in terms of significance to the city and to the public. So with that, city staff has several recommendations. One is that we believe it's important to expand the coverage of historic resource surveys in our city to give us the tools necessary to carry out the programs that we're recommending. We feel like that the best way to save significant historic resources is to have them designated as local landmarks and in historic districts. We definitely don't want to give up on our historic district and historic landmark process. We feel that's important. It offers the best protection. It has predictable outcomes and transparent process once it's designated. Again, the process is transparent in terms of what the design guidelines and the standards are. And it causes less uncertainty for property owners in the marketplace. Third, for properties subject to demolition permit applications, we'd offer that the city could conduct a reconnaissance of those properties and offer and share with the property owner, or with the applicant, excuse me, the city findings in terms of historic significance. We think that sort of public education would be helpful. If the city council believes in the end that it's still important to enact demolition controls in some form, again, the city staff has a lot of real concerns about both of these sorts of tools. But if we had to choose one over the other, demolition delay is much preferable. In that more preferable than demolition review for the reasons that we talked about previously. Allowing a landmark application to be submitted during the delay period would provide some more predictable outcome for protecting historic resources if a demolition delay, if the council felt that demolition delay ordinance was important.
Okay, thank you, Robert. Let's begin our discussion. Mayor?
You're suggesting that it should be limited to properties that are 75 years older, or 75 years old or more. What proportion of the demolitions have been for that age of property?
We don't have a solid number for the percentage of properties that are 75 years old or older, but I believe that the large majority of them are 75 years or older. There's not nearly as many new buildings being demolished, but it does occur.
Danielle?
I just have a few questions to start with. The first is, did the Historic Preservation Commission weigh in on this? I can't recall in what I've read, hearing that they did.
Now I've got to remember myself. I'm having to jog my memory.
I know they did. I know that we talked about neighborhood conservation. They talked about neighborhood conservation. And, when we had our joint conversation, we talked about incentives and things like that. But I just didn't know if they had talked about the demolition review or not, or if they had it input yet.
I apologize. I'm just drawing a blank. Let me think about that for just a minute, and I'll get you the information.
Okay. The chair.
The chair came for the itself, but it wasn't brought as a case.
Okay, it wasn't brought as a case, but the chair came to council, or to the committee. Okay, I remember that. And then my second question is, I guess in talking to folks, and there's a lot of demolitions and fires for that matter, of course, rental registration hopefully will help with that in my ward. And I'm really impressed by Dallas's, I guess Dennis had provided Dallas's ordinance, talking about demolition neglect, in particular the demolition by neglect aspect. And in the Dallas one, just a brief piece of it is that basically, if you can't keep it up to code, then sell it, is kind of the thought. But it's specific to overlay districts. So there's certain sensitive districts that are selected, and then basically, the thought is, you need to keep it up to a certain degree, and you can't just let it deteriorate. The Elm Street properties would be a perfect example of this, because at one point they had over 100 code violations, and it was difficult for the city to get them in compliance, but they did come into compliance. But there was some maneuvering on our part to do that. And that was a situation where at that point, after about 100 code violations, and I was told actually that there was some issue with a cat falling through the roof, or I don't know, there's various stories of those properties, where there were real issues of a code nature. So I guess my question is, what are staff's thoughts in terms of this issue of demolition by neglect, and us actually taking the tact of trying to intervene before it gets to the point where they're submitting the demolition, but we're actually looking at keeping homeowners or landlords accountable for a basic level of acceptability of their properties that has to do with code and safety, et cetera.
Well, a couple of things. First, honestly, I've always been a little perplexed by the demolition review ordinances. There are some cities around the country that have them. By demolition by neglect ordinances. There are a few cities around the country that have demolition by neglect ordinances, and in my mind, I've always thought, isn't that what the minimum maintenance code is supposed to be for? Now, these demolition by neglect ordinances is somewhat of really a heightened maintenance expectation. But again, you still run into the very same problems that you run into with administering the minimum maintenance code. You still run into the exact same problems that you do with that. They're really no different. Getting people to comply, for instance, issuing citations, taking people to court, getting them to comply with the court order, they're really quite the same. Alice Novak, the chair of the Historic Preservation Commission, she spoke briefly at the last meeting, and just a little bit about demolition by neglect ordinances, and she had mixed feelings about them, if I recall correctly.
Charlie?
But I think Libby's going to answer the question.
Go ahead, Libby.
Well, let me add, we've done a series of things. We've got rental registration, and we've revised our property maintenance code. Doesn't that do the same thing?
Well, yeah, I think some communities may not have as strong a housing program that we have, and it's getting stronger, but we have housing inspectors, we have an active population that will call in complaints, we have very strong tenant protections now in rental registration. We've had systematic inspections now extending to single-family homes. So we've been through most of these properties, and we've used block grants to rehab. We've got our housing rehab specialists as well. So I think we've kept up. We have a vacant properties register as well. So there's a process by which, if a building is not occupied, it needs to be secured. And we're very active with the legal division in prosecuting and monitoring these cases. So I think our housing program is working very well and should prevent demolition by neglect. So I don't think we need the Band-Aid of historic preservation. There's other tools that we can use to attack those problems before it gets to that point. Some communities, they have large area, diminishing population, large areas of vacant properties that can't keep up, but we've been able to keep up.
Charlie?
Well, it seems like we've, in the 2.5 years on council here, we've tackled this issue by getting a series of ordinances in place, the rental registration, revised property maintenance code. We've just started some historic preservation incentives. That's another piece, so we keep adding tools to the toolbox that community development has for this. And so, what missing pieces do we need to complete the toolbox, and how long do we have to wait? How patient do we need to be to see the results of the tools we've put into place? So I know we're anxious to see some transformations, but they aren't going to happen overnight. It's taken 35, 40 years to see some of the demolition through neglect consequences that we've seen in some of our neighborhoods. Hopefully it won't take, that many years to reverse the process, but, I don't know if Libby and Robert want to make a guess as to, when we might, we've seen some stabilization, but, when do we see a real turnaround? When might we see a turnaround, and what other tools do you think we really need? That's sort of an open question to the two of you.
Again, I feel like we do have, considering the rental levels, we do have relatively well-maintained housing stock. We do have some focus areas in our target areas that we're looking at surveying and hopefully beefing up rehab in these areas. But some of these buildings, as they get older, they may not be historically significant, but it becomes a point where it would just cost too much money to upgrade them. So that's a different process of demolishing what you might consider to be blighted or unsafe properties, and we'll be pursuing that as well. In terms of the rest of the stock, I just feel that we can see positive results in a short term if we have incentives for historic preservation, if we have redoubled efforts and more landmarks and more awareness, in addition to heightened maintenance requirements and rental registration. It seems to me that we would be able to see a turnaround in short term. So it's like a two-pronged approach. It's preservation, using our housing codes and historic preservation incentives, economic development programs, and then the other prong would be in those areas where it's really gotten too far and it's become unsafe, we will need to do some targeted rehabs and possibly demolitions. And I think we would see results quickly.
I'm going to take the chair and recognize Lynn so that she can weigh in.
Thank you. I strongly support what staff has recommended here in terms of actively going out and promoting the programs that we have. And I think that with what we've talked about tonight, and Brandon, your points earlier about adding staff to this important area would help us to be more proactive about that and using that as a tool as opposed to setting any type of demolition review or demolition delay. I see that as problematic in terms of just the momentum of the real estate market, just PR in terms of delays when you come to the city of Urbana for things, and so I hope that we can continue to promote historic preservation, but do it in a more reaching out perspective. And if we add staff, maybe we can do more of that.
I'm going to give the chair back to Lynn.
Thank you, Dennis.
I think that the discussion has brought up a lot of important points and is very reasoned. But I would like to actually pursue a proposal, and I'm going to make a motion, I believe, to request more study on demolition delay. I think that we do have, I think that staff has indicated and we have talked about that we do have tools to help reverse the trend of decay of our historic buildings in the future if they are applied, and property owners who are buildings where property is being slowly eviscerated by time and elements and without due repair can be turned around perhaps. That's very suitable for preserving the historic buildings of our town. But in the meantime, there are instances where some reconsideration or action should be available to the citizens of this community. And if demolition review is too heavy a task to establish for various reasons, I would propose a motion to establish a program of demolition delay. And I think that it could be based somewhat on the Chicago demolition delay ordinance that was outlined in the packet. And I would suggest it would have these elements in it, that first, the building should be 75 years or older. That would be subject for a delay. Preferably, they would be in one of the areas where we have 6 previous surveys created on the housing stock in our area. Third, that further studies of the housing stock and increased surveying of the community at a risk in historic homes that are approaching 75 years and older should be completed. That the delay would be for a minimum of 45 days, so that the house that was under consideration, there would be plenty of time to process, to contact the property owner and to make some kind of communication available. This is important because many of the property owners are not local. They might be not only upstate or out of state, but they may be out of the country at certain times traveling. That during the delay period, that we would allow a landmark application process, just as they do in Chicago, and I think it's also in Eugene, Oregon, where no, it's in it was Glencoe, Illinois, I guess it was, so that interested people who would like to pursue a discussion of landmarking would have an opportunity to make that application, and it would be allowed. Of course, if landmarking turned out to be unsuccessful, or an agreement was not reached with the owner, or there was not a new buyer found for the property, it would be allowed that the demolition would take place. That there would be a set aside a $25 fee to assist with the research that might be required in the archives if it wasn't already a home listed in the survey area, and that the list of homes that are in the approved survey areas should be published about once a year as to upgrade the list and make it available to the public. So I think that if we would approve the process of demolition delay, 45 days is not so much time that it would harm the ultimate use or development of the property in some other manner, but it would allow people who have a concern for the demolition or the loss of historic buildings to take some kind of proactive remedy or action to meet with the property owner to try to achieve some kind of more successful goal for preservation.
Okay, there's been a motion on the floor. Is there a second for this motion? Second by Mr. Smythe. Discussion? Brandon?
Yeah, maybe if I could just ask a few questions to make sure I understand the motion. You didn't mention about whether it would be limited to residential zoning districts or just apply everywhere. Did you have a particular view on that?
I think it's possible to limit it to residential zone districts, because probably the transference of properties that were commercial would have a much bigger discussion ahead of time.
Other questions or comments, Mayor?
I think one of the biggest concerns about demolishing existing buildings is what they're replaced with. And I'd like to see design review, and I think that's what people would like to see in their neighborhoods, that you don't just get some really ugly or boring building put up to replace something that was charming. So we also have to keep in mind that if we can't demolish things, that's could be in conflict with our goal of having infill. But we want quality infill. And sometimes we're not getting that. So I hope I don't know if Danielle's motion had anything about design review, but I think that's something that we should include.
Okay, Charlie?
Yeah, actually, I was hoping that we could get design review discussed before we got into a real motion, but because design review also comes into play in the next item on the agenda, neighborhood conservation districts. A lot of the whole conversation about neighborhood conservation districts comes out of the issue of properties being demolished and inappropriate things being put in their place. And so this is very tied to the next item on the agenda, the way I see it. And probably the single biggest reason why there's a push for, among some people, for neighborhood conservation districts. So I think that the staff has recommended 2 items here on page 5. Continuing working on our ongoing program of designating local landmarks and historic districts, and we've just done a piece for that, I think. And we're moving on that one already. The second piece that they recommend was enactment of design review in additional sensitive areas is also recommended. And what are those sensitive areas? But I also support Dennis's approach because it identifies a very small subset of houses in our community. There are about 1,000, let's see, a little over 1,000 properties, I believe, in the various historic surveys that have been done. That list needs to be revised. And if we're going to limit demolition review to that very distinct set of homes and allow for the historic landmark designation process to take place if it's needed, then we add one additional small tool to the toolbox. So design review is another tool that we could put in there in these historic areas, and we could further define a subset within the historic area of these 1,000 homes that might qualify for a historic landmark designation, or to allow somebody to come along and maybe willing to rehab the house. So I think there are 2 pieces to what Dennis is doing here. But I think incorporating design review, some direction for staff to go forward with design review is important here.
Dennis, and then Robert.
Yeah, I totally agree with you about the importance of design review. But because demolition has to do with the taking down of a house, and it has nothing to do with the proposal of what might occur or what might be built in the future, I think that the demolition delay motion should be separate. And I think we should build an ordinance that addresses if the demolition occurs, how do we perceive our needs as a city to make the infill appropriate and match the community on the street that the infill is taking place. And I think you're right. I think it has to do, this discussion is a very appropriate one and very much tied with these issues. And I think it might be more something we can talk about with the neighborhood community, the neighborhood conservation districts. I don't think I would like to see it linked specifically with the wording of the demolition delay motion.
Robert, and then Danielle.
That's correct.
Okay. Danielle?
I think I've been struggling with the neighborhoods conservation issue. I know we're about to talk about that, and I kind of wish we had done it the other way around, which is I see the neighborhood conservation as a way to have an overlay of a district, in part based on the consent of that district, to restrict demolition. I think that the neighborhood conservation, it's called neighborhood conservation.
Yeah.
So at the very least, it's going to include demolition. I have some concerns about what we've talked about with neighborhood conservation, and I've presented those, and we'll get to that next. But I guess my question is, could it be that neighborhood conservation would address this? The second is, could it, and a little bit picking up on the spirit of what Lynn has talked about, I would like to see that when we survey houses and we kind of identify ones, that we actually tell people that these properties have been, congratulations, your property is one of the star properties in our community, and we have this plaque program. We'd really like to put a plaque up in front of it before you even do, whether you do historic preservation or not. We'd like to mark, the architect in the year. And here's the incentives that we have, so that it's much more of a carrot approach, kind of in the front end. And people are informed, and they're given what their options are. I have a concern about your motion, and so I don't know how to vote for it yet, which is that continuing to study demolition delay is going to potentially create a lot of demolitions, because people are going to think, oh, they might be restricting my property rights, and this is the time to act. And I'm real concerned about that. I'm also concerned about the moratorium for the sake of some of the issues that have been on the, well, I know some of the things that are coming up in terms of economic development incentives, et cetera, and I'm concerned about blanket moratorium and what that would mean for our community. So, although I like the spirit of your motion, I'm concerned about what it's going to mean after this. Oh, is it?
Could I
You
address
can't
that?
hear me?
Okay.
So those are my concerns, and I guess maybe we could actually consider talking about conservation districts.
Okay, Dennis?
Well, first of all, I see the motion for approving a demolition delay as something that meets current immediate need. It also is, you could say, a 45-day temporary experience, because at the end of it, either the parties that are involved are going to make an agreement upon the future renovation of the property, the transference of property rights to a new owner, or they're going to agree not to agree. If they agree not to agree, there is no recourse, really. The property owner continues with the demolition. So really all it does is allow 45 days where there can be some kind of a discussion to reach a new agreement. That's what the demolition delay ordinances of other cities provide. So I think that we could actually adopt that without really very much further study. I mean, there's not that much more to study about it. We have the idea, the concept behind it, and I think that if we would enact it, it really allows a better public discussion of what happens to certain historic homes in certain areas that are a certain age, and how we can possibly address their preservation. It becomes an opportunity for a historic landmark designation on a local level, which may save perhaps some important buildings. But it is not a fail-safe, nor is it an answer to the needs of the community to have wiser management of its own housing stock. I think that that the process of we may take several months yet to actually iron out what the neighborhood conservation district ought to be, and there may have to be a lot of public input and discussion and public hearings concerning it. And yet, even at that point, if we adopt it, it doesn't actually set up any particular conservation district. That is yet another labor of a neighborhood that needs to come together, have a consensus, form a document, bring it to the city, go through the process of creating the district. So we can talk about how great conservation districts are, but there's no proof in the future that a neighborhood will actually pull one off. And I think we'll have a discussion about what that is. So I would suggest that at this point, why don't we use a simple tool that is not a tool of, it's not a divisive tool, it's merely an informative tool and an opportunity tool.
I'm going to take the chair from Lynn and acknowledge Lynn.
I think the mayor's made a very good point that we want infill. And we have a lot of our older buildings that are more in the core. And I think this is a little scary to go down this path of demolition delay, which is what we're talking about, Because I think in our minds, we think, well, maybe 45 days isn't very long. But in the eyes of a developer or a business person, it's that on top of a whole additional process that we have that's very appropriate. But it just adds yet another step. And we want to be very careful not to discourage folks from being in our downtown and our other core areas and from developing there. And I think design review is a much more important tool for us to enact as opposed to a demolition delay. And in fact, I think we should listen to our staff who have very much, I feel like you suggest to us, don't do this. We don't recommend this. And you mentioned things like slowing down the market, being in a situation where there's an unknown, so people are going to be much more tentative about making deals, because people are out there making deals, and they're trying to figure things out, and if we add this as another delay to that, I think that could hamper our desire for economic development in our core areas.
Go ahead.
Lynn,
Charlie.
I'll give you the chair back.
Thank you, Charlie.
Well, I think that the way I would support it would be to define it pretty much to the Huna and Wuna residential areas, which are the pieces of the historic. I think they contain almost all of the historic properties that are in question. I don't know how many of the 1,023 that are listed here are outside of those two neighborhood areas. And do Huna and Wuna actually touch each other on the south boundary here along Broadway? Vine, where they do touch right down there, right?
This is a whole chunk of my ward, which
Okay.
is considered one of.
Okay, we might want to expand the definition, but I think if we detuna, okay, we need to define it very carefully as a residential zone. The Huna, Wuna, and any other additional piece that needs to be included in there that isn't in those two neighborhoods, and that way we take out downtown, which is a separate. Yeah, I agree with you. Let's keep downtown and commercial properties out of this, because that's where we've got some big developments in the works, I think, for the most part. And then, I think the real important thing here is that we're identifying maybe 1,000 properties up front from this list, with a process of adding to that list over time. Is that correct, Dennis?
Merely to complete the list, because there's certain streets in the Wuna or Huna neighborhood have not been surveyed. Actually, a lot of the east neighborhood has not been surveyed.
Yeah, I guess I appreciate the concerns, but I kind of think the motion already handles them, because it's limited to only the places we have surveys for, then it's limited to only the properties 75 years and older in that, and then it's limited to residential. So I don't have the same concern that will affect some downtown commercial development, because that's not zoned residential, and it's really different. I think downtown historic preservation and TIF-RIP loans and the programs are very different. The way we've had successes of historic preservation are very different, and it's a very different picture. But I think for the residential 75-year and older category, I support the demolition delay. With regards, it sounds like your motion, Dennis, is basically the same as the staff proposal of the option that would work with staff, except for 45 days being different than 30 days.
Right.
Is that the basic difference between what staff? Yes, which staff kind of suggested, but yeah, it wasn't in the bullet points.
And
Robert, you had a comment.
I think staff was geared towards a delay rather than a review. Is that correct?
Actually, what we were recommending is landmark and historic district to really focus on that. But we felt like that if council still in the end felt like it was important to pursue some sort of demolition controls, that the delay would be better, or preferable, I should say, than the demolition review. We're really kind of dissatisfied with both for the reasons we talked about, but the demolition delay is better.
Delay is better and more compatible with the historical districts.
Well, for
easier to administer.
Yes, for various reasons, including more certainty in the process for property owners, easier to administer in terms of resources and capacity to administer.
And Dennis is pretty much on target, except for the timing of the longer days.
Dennis's,
I only added 15 days to their suggested number.
right, Dennis's proposal is the same. The one thing I just wanted for clarity in your motion, you said the area of those 1,023 surveys. I wasn't sure if you literally meant those properties or the area around it.
I would say that because of the nature of the historic quality of the neighborhoods, yes, the boundaries of the Huna neighborhood and the Woona neighborhood and Broadway Avenue between them. I mean, mainly because, yes, we do have surveys. I don't know how complete they are. I don't know what streets they encompass. And I don't believe that hardly any surveying is done in the east neighborhoods. So, and we have 120-year-old homes in that neighborhood as well.
Brandon?
Could we just sort of do it the way staff had done in the memo by saying it would only apply to properties included among the historic resource surveys on file in the Department of Community Development?
Danielle?
Could we know what properties that is for public transparency before we vote on, I mean, not before we vote today, but before we take a final binding vote? It seems like people need to know that, and that needs to be part of the transparency.
Because this is a motion to forward it to council.
Yes, that's my understanding.
Not tonight, yes.
Well, actually, Dennis's motion was to study it, but then he spoke for moving it forward. So I do want to clarify that actually your motion is just to study it, and I have concerns about that. If we're going to do it, let's do it soon, or else we have to consider a moratorium, and I think that gets very messy. So that, I don't think we should study it. Just because I have the floor, I think, just to weigh in on this issue, I'm concerned about, my biggest concern, even with the limitations, which I think are great, is the issue of infill. And so in some ways, I almost see that this could be something that might end up being temporary, and then design standards come in, or neighborhood conservation districts come in, and then it's not necessary in that place. So that's something that's somewhat appealing. I also think that in most cases, the kinds of demolition that are happening in these particular neighborhoods, I don't see it as an issue of slowing down business development at all because of the specific places that we're talking about. It really is. I mean, if anything, I think people who might be hit are folks who want to develop large, want to develop apartment buildings. And a development like that is going to take at least 45 days. I mean, there's going to be significant lead time on that anyway, so I'm not so concerned about that. I do think we should be very clear about what area or what set of properties that we're talking about.
I think if I can clarify, and Dennis, I think your motion isn't to keep studying it. Your motion is to move forward with something to council next week. Is that correct?
Well, I'll say yes. Okay, if I feel like this is not a complex issue, it's fairly straightforward. I think it might, there might be some input. We don't know exactly what the shape of the survey areas are, but it's really a tool to which, as Danielle suggests, may not be needed in the future as we establish other tools that are more efficient.
Okay, Libby has a comment.
Yeah, I think this is somewhat tricky legislation that's being proposed, and it's probably proper to direct staff to prepare an ordinance that accomplishes these items. And then we can get our legal staff involved, and this is very tricky, and we don't have maybe necessarily the best legal basis, so it has to be done very carefully. And so the map is very important. We can't just say, oh, these boundaries, just because we say these boundaries. We need a defensible basis, and the only basis we have is this map, which is in your thick memo, September 6th. So it's like a little patchwork, and it cannot be described as Huna and Woona. It's what's been surveyed. This begins to create somewhat of a defensible basis for the delay. So I think it's important. And what I wrote down in your original motion reflected this.
Actually, it did. My original motion said that the surveyed areas, and then to ask that the surveys be enlarged.
And I think the count, Charlie's count, sounds Correct, it sounds in the ballpark.
Could I maybe ask the motioner and the seconder to take from the table the original motion, and maybe we'll have a new motion based on what Libby suggested?
Well, the original motion is actually what the motion was.
Okay, so for staff to prepare an ordinance.
Well, I'd like to see it, I mean, yes. I think that if we saw this again in 2 weeks at the committee level, and there was a drawn-up document, that would be useful.
Libby?
Possibly, I don't want to speak for legal staff, but we will do our best, and we just want to, need to define all the details, so expeditiously, or...
Okay, so let's make sure the motion is clear. What's on the table is that, at this point, is we're asking staff to develop an ordinance based pretty much on a demolition delay of 45 days with a few of the other, and based on the 1,023 homes that have been surveyed.
Right.
And, Mayor?
I thought it was important to have the surveys as a basis. Because they've been surveyed, we can make an assumption that they're potentially valuable. And so there's some parts of the neighborhoods that are newer, rather, and were not surveyed and wouldn't need to be covered. And well, remember, there's the previous recommendation, which was actually recommended. We're just doing our best here. But our original recommendation was to complete the surveys and then to proceed with whatever protections were deemed necessary. And the reason we recommended that was to have that solid legal footing. So that was our initial memorandum. Certainly, enacting this ordinance wouldn't prevent us from continuing with the university to complete those surveys. And they can be incorporated into the delay process as they come online.
Okay, Charlie?
Well, at this point, I think we need to take Carolyn Baxley's advice. And if we're going to pursue this, and it's going to take a while, we're not going to enact something next Monday, then it really is necessary to have a demolition moratorium for 6 months. And, to be for a very defined area, the defined area that would contain the area that needs to be finished surveyed, for example. And also, Lynn, I think there were some of those public input comments were for people who wanted to speak twice on 2 different issues, and they've only spoken on one of the issues. I don't know how
Carolyn
that...
Baxley
had
indicated both issues. And Ilona and Lois. So if any of them want to come, are you suggesting that if anyone want to add to the conversation at this point?
Yeah, I think that was, they should have probably handed in 2 separate yellow sheets. I don't know. We've never had a situation where people have spoken to 2 different issues at 2 different times. And
that's
so,
fine. If anyone would like to come up and make another public statement, that would be fine. Ilona or Lois, or would you like to come? Okay, come on up.
Thank you for the chance. Just a few comments, since it has gone far beyond some of the comments that I wanted to make, but I'd like to make some comments, definitely. One is that the demolition delay, although it's better than nothing, it really provides absolutely no incentive to owners who want to demolish their buildings to decide not to demolish their buildings. There's no incentive against demolition for the owners of the buildings. It gives us a chance to, well, as opposed to demolition review, there's an incentive for not demolishing if the fees are high enough, if they have to pay for the survey of the building, the historic survey, historic studies, fees can be high enough to discourage people from slumlording and then asking for demolition with demolition reviews. Demolition delays provide no incentive against demolition for slumlords. But in any case, demolition delay gives us a chance to write historic proposals if somebody wants to do that. That's a very involved process, and so far in this city, not many people have stepped forward to do that stuff. And so it may fall on the exact same people over and over and over again if there's no staff to do that. And after a while, the same people may not want to keep doing that. Second, if we base the demolition delay boundaries on the already surveyed areas, that leaves East Urbana basically out, so there's not even demolition delay for East Urbana, so anybody can go in and slumlord and then get a demolition permit and put up a new apartment building. So I would suggest that basing it on existing surveys will do no good for East Urbana whatsoever. The existing surveys are not complete. As we have seen in the last few months, buildings that we knew nothing about turned out to be very important historically and architecturally, so we cannot base our judgment of demolition delay on the existing surveys. And third, I think it is very important that we include design review in the demolition delays. I don't think it should be attached to something else, for example, the establishment of conservation districts, because neighborhoods may establish them, may not, maybe nobody will ever establish them, so then there will be no design review. A point in case, just as an example, there are two areas right now, historic areas, where demolition permits have been given. One is the 502, 504 West Elm, the building right next to 502, just got a demolition. There has been a demolition permit issued for that. The building will be destroyed. There will be a new building put in, and there is no review of the new building. So we have two historic buildings and absolutely no review of what's going to be put next to them. Anything can be put next to them. So this is a real problem. What are we doing? Why are we being concerned about historic preservation if we turn around and we just let people put anything right next to them? What is that going to do for the value of the historic building? What is that going to do for the historic context of the building? It will destroy both. The other example is Main Street, which handed in, the 800 block in Main Street, handed in an application for a historic district status. At the same time, one of the landowners, Wakeland Properties, has gone ahead and asked for demolition permit, got the demolition permit, took the building down already, and is planning to put in a plastic apartment building as we can expect it, and there's no review of that, what he's going to put in there. So again, we are creating potentially a historic district, and there's absolutely no control of what the current owner is going to put in there, no public control, in other words, what the present owner is going to put in there. So I think we have to decide, as Mr. Lewis said, do we really want to do historic preservation or we don't want to do it? And if we want to do it, we have to provide the tools and make up our minds that this is what we want to do. Otherwise, we are just playing games that I don't think will lead to any serious historic preservation. I think the incentives have to be strong enough against demolition and strong enough for preservation. And because of that, demolition delay is not very strong, but better than nothing, and I think it's absolutely necessary. And I think it will provide at least some incentive against slumlording. So I'm very strongly for it, but also with a design review for the new buildings, and not to tie design review to the establishment of conservation districts, etc. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, just to refresh ourselves, we're back to the motion on the table that Dennis reiterated, and it's Libby noted that it's something that needs a little bit of time to be worked on, and so it may be that it would come back as soon as possible, as opposed to a specific time, depending on the legal things that have to be investigated.
And, I mean, we could make it a priority if there's a concern about reactions in the marketplace. We would certainly try to move that ahead as a priority and
So
try to
2
get
weeks,
that
you-
ordinance prepared, so. I
Okay.
just didn't want to speak for others on staff.
Okay, all right, so that's where we're at. We have a motion on the table, and it's, looks like we could have something come back to, an ordinance could come back to committee in 2 weeks. Are we ready to vote on that motion? All those in favor of the motion indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? There's one nay, the motion passes, so we'll look for an ordinance in 2 weeks. Thank you very much. Let's go on now to item number 11. Brandon?
Yeah, there are actually parts of the staff recommendation that we didn't really take action
Yeah.
on.
Okay.
On page
Yeah.
7
All
of the original memo, not the supplemental memo, there were 3 very good proposals that I'd like to move that we direct staff to move forward with. The first is expanding the coverage of the historic resource surveys. The second is expanding efforts to designate historic landmarks and districts in a few different ways. Those are using the surveys and other resources, requesting the U of I Historic Preservation class take time, amending the Historic Preservation Ordinance to allow commissioners to nominate landmarks, and having community development budget staff time on an ongoing basis for this. And then their third one is that city staff would provide information about possible historical significance to property owners when they submit a demolition permit. So I think that staff recommendation I completely support, especially the piece about historic preservationers being able to nominate and then refrain from voting, obviously.
Is that a motion?
I would move that we direct staff to move ahead on those 3.
Okay, is there a second?
Second.
Further discussion? All those in favor of that motion indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, motion adopted. Okay, thank you. Now, on to number 11.
Well, actually, there's one more piece.
One more,
On
okay.
page 5 of the memo of September 20th, the supplemental, the second recommendation of staff is the enactment of design review in additional sensitive areas is also recommended. I would, I'd like to direct staff to begin that process with the Plan Commission.
Okay, simple motion. So is there a second?
I second it.
Okay, any discussion? All those in favor indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? That motion passes. Anything else?
Madam Chair,
Yes,
just
Robert.
clarification, we are looking at a design review, correct?
That is what Charlie just noted. Mhm. Number 11, ordinance number 2007-06-059, an ordinance approving a text amendment to the zoning ordinance of the City of Urbana, Illinois, adding Section 8-5 Neighborhood Conservation Districts to the Urbana zoning ordinance. Plan case number 2023 T06. This is back from a committee meeting in June 25. Robert, you have the floor.
Right. Just as a quick refresher, in our comprehensive plan, neighborhood conservation districts is suggested as a possible tool for neighborhoods and to help neighborhoods be stable and to help perpetuate the qualities in neighborhoods that people love so much. So in response, City Council asked city staff to study possibility of having a neighborhood conservation district ordinance here in the city of Urbana. And one of our staff members did a very detailed study about how this tool is used in other cities around the country, how it might be modified for use here in Urbana, what would be the benefits, what would be drawbacks, in other words, strengths and weaknesses, what can we already do without this, with this ordinance, what could be additionally done with such an ordinance. And what you have before you here tonight is a proposed amendment to the zoning ordinance that would allow property owners to come together or neighborhood groups to come forward and to apply for designation as a zoning district, overlay district, and for certain protections that they feel are necessary in order to protect the things that people really value in that particular district. It's different than a historic district in that it's not necessarily tied to historic preservation. It could be neighborhoods that don't necessarily qualify for historic district status, but neighborhoods that people still feel like there's a lot of aspects that they really value and they want to perpetuate. And actually it's written such that it's really defined by the applicants. We're not necessarily providing so many preconceived ideas about what those things are that people really are going to value in those neighborhoods. Having said that, probably one of the key aspects of what property owners and neighborhood groups, probably what I envision they would want to enact would be design review for their area as far as new construction comes along. What's infill going to look like? How's it going to fit into within the designated area? And so we've set up a process, and this is really what it's all about. All of this is about setting up a process. It's not about designating any one particular area. If this should be enacted, again, this would not designate any one particular area as a neighborhood conservation district. It would just empower property owners and to neighborhood groups to come forward and apply for this. We do have we are suggesting a high bar, a high standard in terms of where this could be enacted, and that would include, we are sending notice, for instance, to property owners in the affected area, and what we would have in this ordinance as currently suggested is that at least 60% of those responding to our property owner preference form would need to be in favor in order to enact it. Not at 60% of all property owners in the district as we had originally suggested, but we have made that change based on public comments and some comments by council members. So it'll be 60% of the property owners responding. Since the last time we met, I've tried to incorporate the comments that you provided and that were provided at that public meeting, and there was a strikeout and underlined version that you have here before you. The Planning Commission has provided input on this. The Historic Preservation Commission has provided input at multiple meetings, and this is essentially where we're at today. So if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Okay, Heather?
Most neighborhoods, if you want to put it that way, have covenants, and that in and of itself has protections which allow people to or not do certain things with their properties. Since these aren't really quote unquote, well, I guess they are. I mean, they're neighborhood conservation districts. Do they not have covenants in these neighborhood?
Well,
I mean, I guess I would hate to see staff taking time to do this if there's something already in place,
right,
such as a covenant. Like where I live, we have covenants. You know, we can't put a fence that obstructs our neighbor's view of the lake, for example. Things like that. My question is, you know, that's in place, so we wouldn't need something like that to protect.
Those are, I envision that this would occur in areas that are existing neighborhoods where they don't have private covenants. Most areas with private covenants are neighborhoods that have come about in, say, the last 20, 30, 40 years. But these are neighborhoods probably that are older than that don't necessarily have private covenants. And, of course, private covenants are totally administered and followed up on by neighborhood groups and by the public, by the private property owners. And the city doesn't get involved in private covenants. We don't have any powers whatsoever to enact private covenants.
Okay, so the flip side of that is, since there aren't, for resale purposes of a home, I think that, I mean, I know what I can and can't do in my home or around my home because I have those. I think that if I were to resell my house, someone buying it would know what could or couldn't be done. I think that would be important in a neighborhood conservation district if you're going to have 60% of the surrounding area that if one person wanted to sell that house, that when they have it for sale, that someone who's possibly going to buy that property know that what they could or couldn't do with it to cause them to make that decision either way.
Charlie?
Yeah, Heather brings up the interesting aspect of this in that this is a way for a group to establish, in effect, a covenant post facto, after everything's been done. The problem with it, and here's where the objection is that it could potentially force the 40% who don't agree to conform with the other 60%. When you buy into Behringer Commons or Stone Creek or one of the other areas where there's an existing covenant, you know what you're getting into when you walk in. The covenant is established when they buy up front. For a neighborhood conservation district, you'd have a large group of people that are saying, we're going to create a covenant after the fact, and that's the tricky part. Okay, that's just to put it in a nutshell, that's the problem. And do we want to allow people? Do we want to allow 60% to set a standard for a particular neighborhood, much like there would be in a newer subdivision? I have seen covenants in action in the condo that's next door to my house. It works great. They've got a good condo association. They have good, strong covenants, and it's a very well-run property. There's another condo 2 houses down. It's a co-op, very similar structure. Again, it runs very well, and so those covenants, when you're buying in advance and you know that those covenants are there, I think it's very easy. You know what you're getting into. Setting up a neighborhood conservation district is difficult, and I'm having a little trouble with this because it is saying that 40% might be on the end of something that they really don't want to be on. So.
Mayor?
I would point out that we can pass an ordinance with 4 out of 7, which is less than 60%, I think.
Danielle and then Brandon.
I have a couple of questions for us to consider and then some concerns. The first is, I've supported neighborhood conservation in part because I wanted some level of stopping the demolition, which we just did. We're talking about doing design review, so we're taking care of that piece. I wanted to incentivize people doing historic properties. We've done that. And so my question, okay, so the question is, what exactly are we adding here that isn't in that? The thing I like about this is it gets communities involved. I like the involvement, and I like people talking to each other and designing things that are unique to their community. I like that aspect. My concerns, and actually the amendments go against my initial concerns. They go in the opposite direction. I'm concerned of overreach. It looks like they can decide anything. And so if a motivated group of people gets together and they're able to kind of move quickly, they could do things that actually I think are not necessarily in the best interest of the community as a whole. I'm particularly concerned, and again, I come from Florida, and if you came from Florida, maybe you would understand too, that, because I'm so glad I don't live in Florida anymore. It's a state of gated communities. Everything's the same. It's very particular. I mean, talk about neighborhood covenants. It's like that gone berserk. I mean, Behringer Commons has very reasonable neighborhood covenants. In Florida, it's beyond what you can imagine, such that people can't even put things on their mailbox. Like, it has to be that every mailbox looks the same. So, not to say that that's the spirit of Urbana, but my concern is this idea that we want to fix things in time. And I guess, I ask people, what is it that we'll get from this? And they point to some of the new houses on Green Street, not the ones on the south side that I think were pretty well done, but these on the north side that look like they're supposed to fit in. They look like Disney World to me. They're like an attempt to look like it was built 100 years ago, but of course it's not built 100 years ago. And what about new ideas and innovative architecture and people trying things new? And I'm concerned about this keeping things the same gesture. I think that HUNA and WUNA and DTUNA would all be extremely enhanced by having design review, which is different from we want to establish requirements that generally keep things looking the same as what we have now. Because I think that that's the Siebel building, which is my favorite building in town. There's no way that would have been built on campus if it was, let's keep everything looking like everything else on campus. And yet it's just one of the most innovative pieces of architecture I've ever seen in my life. And actually Krannert, it's the same thing, and so is the Assembly Hall. I'm not thrilled about that design, but I think Krannert is a great design. That would have never been built if under these kinds of standards. And I think that Krannert is this amazing piece of architecture. I remember it from visiting as a kid. It stuck with me. So I think that's a concern. My last concern is the length of process. And staff has mentioned with other things how long it would take to have, say, demolition review, which is not what we're going forward with. But I think of this as hugely process-oriented. And if I think about allocation of resources of staff time, I'm not sure that with everything else we've done, if this is the right way. So my last comment is that I think if HUNA wants to do something to have an overlay because it's a sensitive neighborhood and it's been having problems with both demolition but also incompatible development, then let's see something come from HUNA, and let's not necessarily make a two-step process. Let's have HUNA bring something to us, and let's consider in the public realm a neighborhood conservation district for HUNA and start there instead of enacting this, because I think this is just too broad and it opens up for too many restrictions and too much staying the same.
Brandon and then Charlie.
Yeah, I generally support this. We've seen it a few times. It's been through a couple commissions, and I'd like to move it forward. I don't share the same concern that Charlie had about 60% of the people imposing their will, because I agree with the mayor. Right now, we've already got design review in the MOR district. We already have said we want it in the Lincoln-Busey Finger, and talked about it in even other areas like East Urbana, where people complain about apartment buildings that are incompatible new buildings with the surrounding residential neighborhood. So we enact that just with a majority of us. And we hear from the neighborhood. They come here. It goes through multiple commissions. There's a public process. And that's the exact same thing that would happen in this. This is just an invitation to the neighborhoods to tell them, if you want design review and these kind of conservation measures in your neighborhood, come up with a plan and bring it to us. The door is open. We're here to hear from you. I also don't share, Danielle, your concern about things looking the same or about locking people in architectural time, because this really just says that we'll create design review and design guidelines. And I think you support the kind of design review process, and I do too, and I think it's working reasonably well in the places we have it. It's certainly helped buildings to fit in more compatibly with what's around them than before we had it. And I think this just says that we'll help the neighborhood create their own design guidelines, and it certainly doesn't, it lets us create the same kind of design guidelines that we have in the MOR and that we've wanted in these other areas. It doesn't need to impose any architectural limitations. And obviously when we send it to Plan Commission, when we look at it, when the neighborhood comes, we'll see what they want in their design guidelines and what they think captures the spirit of their particular neighborhood and what they want to support. And we'll have the ability, just like we already do now, to review it and decide whether it's something that should pass. So maybe feel free to explain maybe if you feel this is really different from the existing design guidelines, or that this does open the door to architectural limitation. But right now, I don't see that concern and don't think that's any more of a concern than it is with the existing reviews that I think work well.
Charlie, I believe you're next.
Yeah, I guess Brandon made one of the same points I was going to make in terms of this is a framework for a neighborhood plan. The other aspect of it is in just directly like Siebel and other buildings on campus now, there is a certain level, there is innovation, but there's a height limit and brick coloring limit, and there are a couple of limits now that are actually in effect to try to have some sense of, you're on a campus that's all part of the University of Illinois. And so your brick color is specific, and the height of buildings is restricted. I know those are two of the main components. Do you know the other ones, Dennis?
Not off the top of my head, no.
There are some design guidelines on campus at this point, yes.
Other comments? Okay, Robert?
Well, I agree with Brandon. I think it's an opportunity for communities to come in and try and address their concerns with regard to growth and development in their communities. I don't think it stagnates the community. I think it gives them latitude. I think the critical point is having the design review process in any city or community. I think that's the key element. And if you have a community that's concerned about their growth and development and infill, as the city is concerned with infill in their area, then I think the design review is going to play a major role in establishing what that community might want.
Do we have a motion for the table?
Yes. Brandon?
Well, I would move to send this to City Council with a recommendation for approval.
Is there a second?
Second.
Okay, there's been a motion made by Mr. Bowersox, a second by Mr. Lewis. Is there further discussion? Dennis and then Danielle.
Well, I'm interested in kind of hearing a little bit more about the process of design review. I mean, I'm totally for having design review. I'm now hearing two different discussions about it. One is that it could be a part of a neighborhood conservation plan, but also I've heard that the city would like to establish a design review process basically independently. Whether it would be tied, it was almost tied to a demolition delay just a few minutes ago. But we've also had a recommendation that design review be now something studied by staff and brought forward. I would go for, I would be willing to have, citywide design review, because I think it might be appropriate. It could be that conservation districts, that'll trump a conversation district's recommendation. And I'm remembering back to when HUNA submitted pretty much on its own energy a neighborhood comprehensive plan. And you know that the official opinion of the city was that it couldn't endorse a neighborhood plan, but it could accept it. So if a neighborhood can come up, spend a quarter of it, 2/3 of a year creating a comprehensive plan for itself, but it can't be, all it can be is accepted as a plan, but not endorsed by the city. I'm thinking, well, okay, we can come up now with a conservation district and have our interests adopted, I guess, by the city and allowed, and that's an empowerment, and that's good for the city, and it's good for the community too. So maybe conservation districts are going to be a wonderful tool. But if the city decides to go ahead with a general design review process for certain kinds of buildings that may well fall into the HUNA neighborhood description, I wonder how that, how these things interact.
I think Libby came to the table in one of its few comments.
Yeah, hopefully I can help on that. We started design review in the mixed office residential zone, and that's a transition area that seemed to need treatment above and beyond just standard zoning, and it has worked well there. And Lincoln Busey would be another transition area where design review can help, because it's not just all single-family zoning, and it's a transition zone, and we're looking at the area between HUNA and downtown as another transition zone. So those are good areas for design review. I think taking design review for all the city would be, we talked about the Burdenford demolition review, that would be way beyond that. We'd have to have a whole another department basically to do that. But the Neighborhood Conservation District is a mechanism for neighborhoods to do a plan which may or may not involve some form of design review. It could involve all kinds of other conservation measures, and I think at the time those plans are developed, the reasonableness of the proposals can be established. So I think design review can be done at many different levels. I don't think the Neighborhood Conservation District prevents or conflicts with what we've done already in the MOR, what we're hoping to do at Lincoln Busey or in HUNA. It's just a different way to attack the problem. But I did perk up when I heard citywide design review, and I think if we look
saw you
at
back there.
just our, single-family construction
perking
in
up.
our subdivisions, we haven't heard that those have been a problem in terms of design. But when
Okay.
you have a new apartment building, maybe surrounded by older single-family homes, then there can be conflict. So that's the transition zone.
Okay, we have a motion still on the table, and first Danielle, and then I think Charlie.
I'd like to amend this motion with a minor change of the purpose, which is page 1, section 8-5A is purpose. I'd like to add a second point between what is now 1 and 2, which includes as one of the purposes of establishing this to promote quality architectural innovation appropriate to a neighborhood. I'm looking for a second.
Okay, there's been an amendment to the motion suggested.
And I just have a question.
And a second.
Oh, look, promote quality architectural innovation appropriate to a neighborhood.
Okay, so you're going to speak to that motion further?
No, actually, I don't feel I need to speak to the motion, but I do have a question about what the initial motion is, which is, you said 60%, I see 50%. What's the original motion? Is it 50 or 60?
Yeah.
I intended the motion to be as staff had written it.
50%.
With the underscores and strikeouts, accepting
Signatures of
staff's change.
60% or more, okay,
the
and then
responding
determining.
owners of record.
Okay, I see it. Thanks, that's all I needed. So,
Okay.
yeah,
All
I
right,
have
so
my amended
we have an
motion.
amendment on the table right now, so let's, is there further discussion about the amendment? Further discussion. All right, if there's no further discussion, all those in favor of this amendment, please indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, the amendment passes. We're now back to the main motion as amended. Further discussion about the main motion? Let's vote on the main motion. All those in favor indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? One opposition. The motion passes. Okay. Thank you. Now we have just a couple things before we adjourn, please. The mayor has a couple proclamations, and I have a note from a prior employee.
Okay. I have a proclamation to have the month of September 2007 as National Alcohol and Drug Addiction Recovery Month in Urbana, because alcohol addiction has affected 74% of Americans at some point in their lives, whether it was their own addiction, that of a friend or family member, or any other who experience addiction. And 63% of Americans say that addiction to either drugs or alcohol has greatly impacted their lives. And this is to call upon the people of Urbana to observe this month with appropriate program, activities, and ceremonies supporting this year's theme, Join the Voices for Recovery, Saving Lives, Saving Dollars. And then the second proclamation is for Kathy Frericks, who has been employed by the City of Urbana Department of Public Works for 21 years as the Public Works Secretary. She was voted by her peers as Urbana Public Works Employee of the Year for 1994. Kathy has always smiled the biggest, laughed the loudest, and brought the brightest and warmest sunshine to Urbana Public Works, and she will be sorely missed by elected officials, residents, colleagues, the community, and her friends with the City of Urbana. Therefore, I, Laurel Lunt Pressing, Mayor of the City of Urbana, do hereby proclaim September 28th, 2007 as Kathy Frericks Day in the City of Urbana, and encourage everyone to wish Kathy well in all her future endeavors.
Thank you. I have a letter from a former employee, Elaine Taylor, and this is from her in her words. I thought I would be at this meeting to address the council, but Joan felt she was ready to handle the meeting, and I agree. Joan has proven to be extremely quick at grasping the functions of this office. I would like to thank the City of Urbana and Cunningham Township for providing me with the means to put food on the table and a roof over my head for the past 15 years. It has been a pleasure to work with you all. I wish you everything you need and half of what you wish for. Warmest regards, Elaine Taylor. Thank you. This meeting's adjourned.